Welcome everybody again. And Today we have Sadie Red Wing with us. Sadie Red Wing is a Lakota graphic designer and advocate from the Spirit Lake Nation of Fort Totten, North Dakota. Red Wing earned her BFA in New Media Arts and Interactive Design at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She received her Master of Graphic Design from North Carolina State University. Her research on cultural revitalization through design tools and strategies created a new demand for tribal competence in graphic design research. Red Wing urges Native American graphic designers to express visual sovereignty in their design work, as well as encourages academia to include an indigenous perspective in design curriculum. Currently, Red Wing serves as a student success coach for American Indian College Fund in Denver, Colorado, where she specializes in student retention and resource building for the Native American demographic in higher education spaces. So thank you very much. And I will hand this over to Sadie again.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. So welcome back, everybody. Just for a quick introduction of myself, again, my name is Sadie Red Wing. I'm a citizen of Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. I'll touch more base on that here in a second. I want to use this time to really share a little bit of what it means to design for a sovereign nation. So being in the realm of being in a community within designers, so either be design research or even to graphic design, what role would a designer play in designing for a tribal sovereign nation? And even to what type of identity or visual representation would be giving to that sovereign nation, and to have awareness of the lack of resources when it comes to building curriculum around those type of area tracks or degrees, or just even to pushing and advocating to get more indigenous perspective within design research and graphic design. So I'm going to get right into it and have a chance to really share my story here. So like I said, I'm a citizen of Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. So my citizenship is within a Dakota sovereign nation, which is the little square in North Dakota. But I identify more as Lakota because I am Cheyenne River Lakota, and I was raised within central South Dakota. So I have greater influence of the Lakota language. But just to know, the Lakota and Dakota, we are very similar in culture. We share a lot of resources. We share a lot of protection amongst specific terrains along the Great Plains, and our languages have great similarities. So it gets a little bit confusing, especially in throwing in Dakota, Lakota, or North and South Dakota. But just to give an understanding, I am bringing a perspective within the Great Plains. So I mentioned before, if you were in the workshop, that this map isn't entirely accurate in the means of showing what is traditional grassland within the United States. And one of the reasons why I say that is I've always heard stories from elders that we would follow us tribes within the Midwest in the United States, thus who are protectors and guardians of the buffalo and the prairie. We would follow the buffalo migration pattern all the way up into Canada in a diagonal down to the Carolinas. But the patterns of the buffalo continued to diminish once colonization happened, once more seeds of trees that kind of really started to flourish among the Smoky Mountains. We got the Louisiana Purchase, and even to farming. Farming has been has done great destruction to a lot of our traditional prairie. So I'm really going to be coming in with a great land focus, especially when speaking from a demographic that is land-based. So like Joel mentioned, I am a student success coach at the American Indian College Fund. Our headquarters is in Denver, Colorado, but we started actually in Manhattan, New York. So we have, in 30 years' time, has been great organization that has helped a lot of Native American students. So in this role, I am more of an advocate for the Native American demographic in higher education spaces. So seeing how retention rates at tribal colleges do well when it comes to maintaining Native American students. And the obvious reason of that is there's professors that look like students that come in with the same language and ideology of these students. They have access to libraries that might be predominantly indigenous authors. and even to having assignments and degree plans of their interests are going to help them demonstrate sovereignty in their Native American community. So I always have to clarify that so folks don't think I'm an actual graphic designer at the organization, but outside of um, the American Indian College Fund, I still do a lot of research on providing great demonstration on what words like decolonization means, especially when we're using it as a verb and not a metaphor, and looking at um, who are the two parties within the Americas that have confrontation over land. It's usually the indigenous parties and the government parties, and what that experience of colonization, what type of perspective from that experience is brought into a design community. So I do, before COVID, did a lot of workshops and talking about inclusivity within within the indigenous perspective. Had a chance to public speak and then also participate in a lot of higher education events that speak to activism or advocacy. And within my work, you'll have a greater understanding of what my activism work looks like, as well as my advocacy work looks like. But just to give, I've always been told, always show your students, give them some type, or even colleagues too, just to see, because it's unfortunate that a lot of folks, they cannot envision what uh, an entire country looks like that is predominantly indigenous. And if they can't envision what a country looks like that's predominantly indigenous, they probably cannot envision what a classroom looks like that is predominantly indigenous. So it's probably new to them to see images of Native Americans within the classroom. So that's a pill I have to swallow sometimes. So to kind of help paint the picture of the communities I work in is to give some light to some of our beautiful faces. So before working at the College Fund and before COVID, in the past 4 to 5 years now, I did a lot of public speaking. I was able to travel the country and travel internationally to provide this presentation called F the Stereotype. And it really tackles um, the harms of stereotypes. And then when you have something like during this time, the Dakota Access Pipeline was going on within Standing Rock, and what is a graphic designer's role at a space like Standing Rock? So I had a really chance to share some of my work. I believe there are YouTube links to this presentation. So if I myself don't like to rewatch myself, but you're more than happy to get on and check some of my work out from the Standing Rock area. But before, and also too, during that time, I was fortunate to teach. I taught at the University of Redlands, where I taught Indigenous perspective and visual communication, inclusive art and design, and intro to visual sovereignty. And then when I taught at the Indian University of North America, I was able to teach Indigenous perspective and computer science. But in any classroom, any workshop space, or any space where I'm, talking amongst a group, I always have to remind ourselves, and this is something I have to remind myself too, is the power we have as designers. And I think as there's more resources and documentaries like The Social Dilemma, our students are getting more familiar of how much power we have as designers and how we create our world, or how we not create, but curate, how we structure somebody's daily experience. And even too, if you, one of my mentors at the College Fund, uh, told me, once I told him my goals within design research of revitalizing visual languages, he said, what is really beautiful is that you are the one that allows somebody to see their language. So think about that. You are the one that actually gives identity to a language. So you have the power either taking away somebody's language or showing it to them. And that's a huge power to have. And I think that's abuse to a lot of our underrepresented demographics that are struggling to sustain their language. But then even to when it comes with language, the verbal language, the visual language, or our identity is abused as well. So I always see the visual language, the verbal language, and even body language as the same level of all communication. So even to having the power of somebody's identity in your hands, like us as visual communicators, we are the ones that give that identity. We give proof that something exists. So for us as Indigenous people, our identity has been in other people's hands, a Eurocentric hands. So to really claim ownership of those identities, it does take respect. It takes some protocoling, and also allows us to provide a play or an open area where we can really progress in bringing some of these ideas into higher education curriculum. In the workshop, we did talk about visual sovereignty and the relation of land when it comes into a indigenous visual language. But for this talk per se, I really want to focus on this idea of sovereignty, because for everybody, 2020 has been insane. And to know of all the aspects that have worked in the indigenous people, in the indigenous demographics favor, there's a lot of, which I will share, this word sovereignty in a lot of more news articles, or it's been brought up in more conversations as we're progressing to have that acknowledgement as a sovereign nation. Now, sometimes that word sovereignty is new to people. And if you don't come from a community that talks about sovereignty as much, to kind of give it a little bit of a focus, or even to give an idea of how we have the conversation of sovereignty in my classroom space, is this idea of nationality. How to visually represent nationality. So to kind of give a little bit of example of how visual sovereignty can be expressed. One thing that needs to be noted is that there's a lot of United States does give federal recognition to Native American tribes, the same as First Nations within Canada. But it's unfortunate that our relatives in Mexico, they don't have that same federal recognition. Of that federal recognition, we do have sovereign rights, and we even get brought into the United Nations. But we may make it to the United Nations, but we don't make it to, let's say, the Olympics or other global events that have ceremonies. So to envision a future of, let's say, the Lakota Nation or the Cheyenne Nation or the Navajo Nation or the Seminole Nation or the Iroquois Nation, what if they participated in something like the Olympics? If they're participating, they may not be, depending on our citizenship, they may not come in as an American citizen. If I am participating in the Olympics, I would come in as coming from the Spirit Lake Nation. So I'd have my own flag, but what would my jersey look like? What would my adornment look like in this space? And who's going to design that adornment? Or even if it's not the parade of flags in the Olympic ceremony, what if we wanted to put a team into the FIFA World Cup? What would our jerseys look like? How would our fans in the stands be honoring our nationality without the use of stereotypes? So this is when this idea of visual sovereignty comes in, and thinking about progression in the future. So as we advance in our sovereign rights, we might make it to the Olympics one day. So that's hopefully I will be able to see that in my lifetime. Speaking specifically to the non-Indigenous folks in the United States, they're sometimes not aware that Indigenous people even exist. So that is something I had to be aware of. Or even too, when you Google something like how many federally recognized tribes are in the United States, this number always varies, and it varies for multiple reasons. One, more and more tribes are going from state recognition to federal recognition. Or even two, some states are losing their federal recognition, and that could be the cause of extinction of a specific tribe. So it's kind of heartbreaking in that sense, but just know that this number always fluctuates. I'm sure this screenshot, because it kind of gives an idea, and it might be a little bit, I should have highlighted a little bit bigger, but in this Bureau of Indian Affairs resource, it has, and I like it, they broke it up into specific regions too. This shows it has 578 tribes with 92 agencies, but the main point in showing the amount of federally recognized tribes is that's a lot of identities, and that's a lot of languages. And I think people get overwhelmed in that aspect. So if I come in as a Lakota designer, it is really hard for me to speak on 579 other nations, 579 other languages, other visual languages. So just to know that there has to be progression in voice in bringing all these nations to the table. So it's unfortunate that we don't have 580 Native American graphic designers. Hopefully one day we will. And even to that point too, as I mentioned, I work with the College Fund. of those 580 tribes, we only have 37 tribal colleges, and that is a little bit hard on us when it comes to educational resources. But the beautiful part is that these tribal colleges are doing wonderful when it comes to including indigenous perspective, and they should be looked at as models for mainstream and westernized institutions who want to incorporate indigeneity into their curriculum. And you can kind of see majority of those schools are along the border of the United States and Canada. But it would be nice too to see in my lifetime that we'd have 580 tribal colleges. And unfortunately we don't. So hopefully as we continue to advocate for greater resources, we will get at least to a triple digit number, more than 37 for sure. And a lot of this talk about sovereignty, we do have to talk about terms like colonization and colonialism. I have been in communities, or I have been in group spaces where I see these two terms confused, or I see these terms misused sometimes, or even to having an understanding that they may be using decolonization or decolonialism as metaphors. And so it's a little bit challenging, or sometimes I feel a little bit of a disconnect when I am brought into a panel or I'm brought into a discussion on decolonizing design. And we're talking about either deconstruction or deconstructing the systematic policies placed within workspaces, or talking about inclusivity in workspaces. But I'm coming into this conversation in a more literal term, whereas here in the United States, who are the two parties that are always fighting over land or at confrontation when it comes to land rights? It's the US government and the Native American tribes. So in my term of decolonizing design, it's more of the system that we're going to design to have our land rights acknowledged. And part of that design process of that community building, or us demonstrating sovereignty, we do have to put identity to that performance. That's where visual sovereignty comes into play. And to give a little bit of a context of why this is becoming more important in higher education and design conversations is the progression the progression of Native American tribes and their fight to have acknowledgement to those land rights. So I'm not for sure. Again, a lot of these articles I pulled are going to be within the United States, but just to know that we do have a history of strong history of land rights that are not acknowledged, but as we're beginning to really have a greater voice in politics, we now have Indigenous women in Congress, which is beautiful. So this idea of sovereignty is going to come up more and more. And what has been beautiful is that tribes have been getting have been getting greater acknowledgement than before. It's not where we want to be at yet, but the progression is there and it's happening fast. We've seen the drop of mascots with the Washington R word, Washington Redskins, the Cleveland Indians, and then more and more schools and universities are dropping more stereotypical imagery. So we know things are coming in our favor. And I'm pulling this highlight out too, because this is one of the major ones that came in 2020, is that the eastern half of Oklahoma, so looking at the Cherokee, the Western Band of Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, and the Chickasaw, and the Seminole tribes, Oklahoma is now acknowledging and honor those sovereign land rights. So meaning anything that might happen within those lands, these tribes have say on how to either prosecute or how to acknowledge or highlight something that might be beneficial, or prosecute something that might be negative within those land rights. And that's a major win. And what is for us who were in the same situation as Oklahoma of wanting to gain those treaty rights, is a little bit harder for us, especially in the Dakota areas, to think of our lands acknowledged. And for a couple of reasons. One, we were 2016, we had the whole Dakota Access Pipeline thing, the whole Standing Rock movement. Ruffled some feathers with the US government, let alone we're always, we hold the longest running court case of the occupiers of the Black Hills, or even too, if the land that was outlined in that 1968 Fort Laramie Treaty was acknowledged. So for us, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, the people of the seven council fires of Ochete, Shakhoim, we occupy spaces that have huge United States tourism and US government influence. So, for example, if one day the Lakota are able to occupy the Black Hills, we have stuff like Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills. The Black Hills holds the Sturgis Rally, and I don't think whoever is in the White House is ready to give up Mount Rushmore or um, other activities that bring great tourism or even terrorism too within the states of the Dakotas. And to kind of give a little bit of a reference on how large that landscape is. So it's not even within Dakotas, even Montana, Wyoming, and Nebraska too. So thinking about if that Fort Laramie Treaty is acknowledged, the Lakota people have rights in that land territory. So are we, so thinking, bringing that in a higher education context and the design context, are we able to demonstrate sovereignty in that land space? Are students getting the degrees, the resources, and the curriculum needed to know how to run and occupy this space? And these are the conversations we're talking about within in tribal communities. We do get in conversations of folks saying, well, why don't you just give up your land rights? And we kind of discourage that conversation because we don't want to give up our sovereignty, let alone we want our land rights to really revitalize a lot of our land territory. And as we're getting to generations that now have the stress of climate change, there's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, or there's a lot of indigenous knowledge that could be helpful in combating climate change. I threw this documentary in there. It's on Netflix. It's called Kiss the Ground. I'll admit it's a good documentary when it comes to explaining the revitalization of a grassland. Why do we need our grasslands? What is the harm of farming, overworking our soil, and also destroying territories and extincting some of our animals and having a lot of that pollution in the air, which has been devastating to our ozone layers, and as well as producing cancers amongst our family. So I do like how this documentary highlights those aspects, but it's unfortunate that they don't have any indigenous perspective in there. There's no interview from a Native American. There is one woman on there who said she was raised by a Lakota grandmother. Well, let's hear from the Lakota grandmother. There's one quote in there that kind of really made my stomach turn, is that when they're talking about how animals migrated and they didn't overwork the soil, that's why they went in that large migration pattern. It was the wolves that herded the buffalo. And I'm just thinking, like, you totally just threw the Great Plains tribes under the bus. Like our whole culture and language and knowledge, TEK, comes from our culture around that buffalo migration or along that prairie. So again, 2020, they're still leaving us out in more contemporary documentaries, but it's a good example of why indigenous tribes in the Midwest want to revitalize the grasslands, and how the grasslands will help with climate change. Now, the challenge too is wanting to get our land rights is part of one of the reasons why we want the grasslands. We want our buffalo back. We have a demographic with poor dietary issues. So we have high diabetes, high blood pressure, and just high obesity rates. And part of that is our access to our traditional diets. Being from the Great Plains, the main source of our traditional diet is buffalo meat, huge in omega-3s. So you can't herd buffalo in a predominantly farming territory, let alone you can't herd buffalo or any of our gaming when our water is contaminated from these oil pipelines. But just to give an example of why it's so hard to have acknowledgments, we always got the US government, National Guard, Army Corps of Engineers, state officials, property owners that want to buy or destruct our territories, and it's not helping us at all. If anything, it's destroying us and it's adding to our extinction and genocide. So just to give a little bit of context of stuff that might not be shown to media, is we're in these rural, impoverished areas, and we still get bullied by the US government. So if we want to combat, if that's a problem that we need to solve, it's going to take some design thinking, and we got to start doing it now, especially as we're seeing, as I'm showing these articles in 2020, more and more tribal areas are getting their lands returned to them. A lot of artifacts and even remains are getting repatriated back to their tribal territories. So for us in higher education spaces that are getting the next generation ready, we have to be aware of what is going on. So I'm just showing some news articles of other aspects within other areas in the United States that are returning land to tribes. And even if it's not, and 148 acres, it's not a lot of acres, but it's something, and it's that progression. So I think that's something that needs to be aware, especially if you have a school, if there's a school or university located in land that might be turned over to a tribal nation. There might be some not necessarily enforced guidelines, but there might be some changes, or even too, if you work at a design firm or a company warehouse that is held within territorial land that is going to be it's going to be acknowledged as sovereign to a tribe, there's going to be conversations that are coming about. So we need to be prepared for those conversations to come. So I'm going to use the remainder of this half to kind of speak on what graphic design looks like in giving identity to a space. Now, I am not in a position, and we have in a traditional American Design Institute does not train a student to design for an entire nation. So not everybody is leaving with their graphic design degree and going to design at the White House and design for the entire United States. But if I have within, let's say, my visual sovereignty classroom, majority of my students are going to leave that classroom and go back to their sovereign nations where they might be put into a position to have to design for their entire nation. So getting them ready to really give identity to space, but not rely on the stereotype when it comes to identity, to actually rely on respected, appropriate, and accurate visual languages in order to increase more education for non-Indigenous folks to understand which tribe and get them to be more, get them to comprehend some of our visual languages. I think that's why folks are it's so easy to, let's say, use Pendleton patterns when it comes to, let's say, festival promo material, or purchasing blankets or any type that might have more pan-Indian Native American symbolism. It's just because folks aren't fluent in our languages as if they were fluent in, let's say, a German language or a French language or even a Chinese language, or even people in the United States and Canada and Mexico are not expected to learn Indigenous languages. So to think about if they were, there would be more greater respect to the history and not so much brushing it under the rug. But there is a movement happening. As I mentioned, everything that's happened in 2020, it's progressing. And now I'm in a position to really bring visual sovereignty into higher education spaces. So if I'm not designing for a sovereign nation, at least I can baby step and design for a space that is specific for, let's say, an Indigenous community. So just recently, before winter break started, the University of Illinois put the implementation plan. They did have a stereotypical chief as their mascot, but now they're working on creating a greater visual community that is more respectful to the Native American population on campus. And that's being true elsewhere. I'm doing something similar with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and doing some branding that is more appropriate in those aspects. But to know this might snowball into something that might go across the nation. So I know it's a goal of mine to really get graphic design students to really think about this, because they might be in a position where they might work with the university and have to work with tribal languages. But there is some challenges when it comes to that. I'm showing this is in the visual sovereignty workshop. I mentioned this idea of how you want to say the progression of the verbal language. And one challenge for us who have a Indigenous language that's kind of forced into the English alphabet is spelling. So spelling we don't have consistent spelling, and part of that is we don't have a consistent dictionary. We have multiple iterations of dictionaries with different spelling and grammar, so it's really hard to have consistency, and it's hard when you want to bring in some branding. So what I'm showing is with the Indian University of North America in the Black Hills of South Dakota, it's an extension program with South Dakota, or University of South Dakota and South Dakota State. So if the University of South Dakota and South Dakota State wants to do greater programming and provide greater space for the Indigenous community, they they're going to ask for some graphic designer, some branding. So we pitched, this idea of Wheezy Pond, which would be one area of that programming, but to bring a Lakota word into a space, South Dakota State and the Crazy Horse Memorial did not approve of it. So it was kind of a slap in the face to us. It's like, we really want to get our language encompassed into these students, and you're not allowing us because our language looks intimidating. The nasal N or the carrots above the H or the I, it's too intimidating to folks, and that's unfortunate. And to utilize this kind of as an example. So again, in that visual sovereignty course, we kind of spoke on our traditional colors of the region. So dyes from specific flowers, or even colors of dirt are a little bit different. So what is beautiful about bringing some of that traditional knowledge into a space like Photoshop or Illustrators, you can enhance the saturation. You can give some life to our colors, but also to kind of see what some of these colors look like in, let's say, the year 2021 versus an artifact from the 1800s in a museum. So it's just beautiful that we now have some tools that we can incorporate in some of this revitalization of color palettes, of language, little symbols, give them some great context. And another area when I was meaning about the language is just branding when it comes to using a language that is intimidating. So I work at the College Fund, as I mentioned. The College Fund does have a scholarship for single mothers. And at the College Fund, we are, if a scholarship is intended to be written in the Native American language, then we're going to keep it written in there. We're not going to translate it to English. We're going to have respect for those languages. But it's a little, again, there's not much comprehension of the languages. So for example, if I was given a list of scholarships to a non-Lakota student, if I was giving it to, let's say, a Navajo student, they might read over this specific Ina na Woksapi P scholarship because they can't read it. They don't know what it is. They can't translate it. So just to know that the more that we kind of push out, and it's going to be the designer's responsibility to start pushing out or even providing more fonts to a lot of these tribal languages to get them so that they can be comprehensible at the level of Spanish and German. Now, again, we may not see that in our lifetime, but we have to at least start the framework on pushing that, and even to giving some branding or visual identity to what would a single mother look like, or giving this example of kind of going away from that stereotype profile and giving what would an individual, Native American individual look like in the year 2021. This project of Our Voices. So UC Riverside Native American community and students and staff created a podcast specific to the Indian Health Services of Riverside and San Bernardino County in Southern California. And in that podcast, it was intended to be an educational tool for physicians, nurses, and doctors, or any non-Indigenous health related or medical related who may have patients of Native American descent, and to make sure that they have cultural competency when working with those patients. So it's a wonderful resource on, developing greater competency or cultural response between, let's say, a patient and a doctor. But then we had to give some branding. So workshopping with the students and having them think, well, how would you make an individual look indigenous without giving them feathers, without giving them a headdress, without putting them in a buckskin outfit or moccasins? And some, trials or some things that we highlight as our dormant. We're very fashionable people, materialistic people. We know that because our fashion gets appropriated all the time, but just even something like earrings. Earrings are can distinct more of a Native American presence, or even too, I think here on the purple gentleman over here, and respectfully saying so, Native American men, it's a little bit harder for them to grow facial hair. And traditionally in our culture, we have long hair. So if you have somebody that might, if you have an individual in your graphic design work that looks a little bit more, maybe you look more androgynous to a non-Indigenous perspective, but providing some light that a male doctor can come in with long hair, or a male doctor can, kind of breaking those gender roles when it comes to color choices or hair choices, but just to have some greater confidence in men, specifically in roles that might be more gendered as female. So great conversations from the students. And I'm gonna wrap it up here with these last two spaces. We ended the workshop conversation in talking about college or school. It's still something contemporary to the Native American demographic, and especially when we come from a very brutal history of boarding school. So something like College Pride, Native Pride, or College Horizons, which is a preparatory program to get high school students ready for college. Being asked to design or do some branding on something like that, or wanting to bring visual language, a traditional visual language that might be onto something a little bit more contemporary, we have to kind of analyze I guess the syntax on how some of the symbolism works and how we can bring something in and to kind of use tropes that little will be more symbolic. So to give a little bit of a reference, I would see this more within our beadwork or quillwork designs, but in my thinking of being a designer, I'm building something like this. I first had to think about, well, what is like a student? And here I have a frog. So if I'm using this frog as a symbol for a student, one of the reasons is a frog, when it goes across the pond, it's jumping from one lily pad to another lily pad to another lily pad. And that's similar to a student's journey when they go from one year to the next. But then also too, that lily pad, it's not stable, it's on water. So that frog is really good at finding balance. And as they progress to the next lily pad, they have a greater understanding of their momentum and balance to the point where they make it to where they get to go. So I've seen that leap similar to the student's journey in school. And then in the corners in the yellow between the frogs are flowers. So, working as a mentor for students, it is my job to really boost the confidence of students, knowing that college is a time where you need to become, that's your time to flourish in your skin, identify how you want to identify, and bring confidence into your work. Because if you're distracted, if you're uncomfortable and insecure in your classroom and your space and your peers, you're not going to achieve at your top performance. So really boosting, how you want to be labeled, how you want to be identified, and others need to respect that in that sense. So flourishing and blooming, and kind of bringing this, I want to end with this story here, the Peteoyate piece. A woman by the name of Heather Lim, she came to the United States from South Korea to study in African and Native American studies. And when she came over here, she said she was surprised that indigenous people still existed. And one of the reasons why it's hard for her is she had no form of media or resources that explain Native American culture. So to know that in 2020 that there's people across the globe that think we're extinct is kind of scary, or it's sad. And one thing that she wanted to do, or she is doing, that she reached out and she told me a beautiful story, and part of the story that I like to share for those who ask, well, how can non-Indigenous people help? Shared her dad owns a book publishing company in New Jersey, and it is her lifetime goal to translate the texts of Native American authors into Korean so that they can start creating a resource bank to be used for other students who might want to come to the United States to research Native American history. So I thought that was beautiful for somebody to devote resources, power, and wealth for as an aid in our existence. I was just mind blown by that, and I was very helpful. And we went through conversations we have in higher education. So a term that we speak is the Buffalo Nation will rise again. It's something we push to motivate that we will revitalize and will be sustainable more with the technology to really hold our cultures and start creating greater resource banks. But to just really kind of give an idea on how this piece is translated, it used icons that to kind of give reference of if a student is unfamiliar with the historical syntax and context to how these shapes are demonstrated, I try to provide some type of contemporary icon that can show like, oh, this might reference a flower, or or just kind of even just these metaphors that bring some nature. So in the corners are these little ledgers of these buffaloes, and these buffaloes are providing sunlight, and the sunlight is going to make this flower grow to the point where it bursts out of the dirt, and it's in this flower, or us as people, or our language, or however, whatever metaphor you want to use, it's going to burst out the dirt, and it's going to join in with the universe here in our cycle. So utilizing methodology that reference reciprocity, that references, maybe more land related terminology when it comes to like research frameworks and whatnot, but just to kind of give a little bit insight on what a visual language would look like on a contemporary piece, and if that contemporary piece is higher education related. But I want to stop there. I want to, thank you everybody who had a chance to come to the workshop, had a chance to listen in on this presentation. I do want to kind of digress and have some time to, if Joel or somebody wants to give me a time limit and see how, if we can have a little bit of dialogue following. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and grab a drink of water, and again, just kind of refocus, bring everyone back after hearing me talk.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Sadie. Wow, that was great. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to either put them in the Zoom chat for those who are here, or also in YouTube link in the live chat window. And we will now open up this conversation to questions. Well, I have a question. I'm not really not really sure if I'm going to phrase it right, but in the workshop we started talking a lot about some of the iconography that was very dear and very very close to the heart in indigenous nations, and the idea that some of it may not be things that we can use or we should use and abuse in contemporary design. Now, so I wonder if what is left, I guess, for the non-indigenous people who are inspired nonetheless to be following in the ways of these design practices, if not the stereotypes that we, like, do we just rebound to the stereotypes because we know people have done it? And of course you get flagged for it, but you're still, able to, approach it in some way. Is that as close as we can get? Maybe that's the question.
So I'm going to say this, and I don't want it to seem arrogant or ignorant or any aspect, but it's always a question to me is, why would anyone want to use indigenous visual languages for something that is not tribal focused? And I get it. I get that folks really admire a lot of our design work. I get that folks appreciate the patterns and the colors and the knowledge, or the I guess the knowledge that goes into creating something. But I was always a little bit confused why folks would want to use those visual languages in any other reference outside of indigeneity. So I guess to kind of give a little bit of a context, so another lecture I give or another assignment I would have my students look at is, when you Google something like Native American graphic design, or if you're doing research and you're getting on Behance or those Google images, a lot of those images displayed in those results are stereotypical. Now, when you start to really dig deep to see where those images come from, they're usually portfolio works of either Europeans or individuals outside of North America. So what we so bringing that research and bringing it into a conversation with students, in comparison, I asked my students, what is your interest in building a portfolio of, let's say, French people, or utilizing, let's say, European visual languages into your work? There is similarities in that workshop I mentioned. There's similarities in the Lakota visual language of, I guess, the conventions of how it looks, similar to, let's say, symbolism in the Middle East, but the practice, as I mentioned, of, let's say, the weaving, the practice of sewing, the practice of threading, or the practice of painting, those are shared. It's just a matter of what resources are indigenous to what specific factors. So I'm gonna answer that part. The second part is, for the non-indigenous folks, do they understand this term appropriation? Do they know the definition of it? How is appropriation different, let's say, adapting or adopting something? And how is appropriation and adaptation different than, let's say, infusion? As we're progressing, there's going to be more multiracial individuals who are struggling to find an identity. They may not have the privilege of knowing their histories, before 500 years ago. So there is a little bit of a disconnect in what our motives are within the Native American demographic. But I think, the best example I can kind of give is, do you understand some of your practices might be a little bit harmful? If not, what is a comfortable way for you to learn? And even too, if what do Indigenous designers do? What do Indigenous students do in their artwork? Does it look like other cultures? If it doesn't, I just think that it's so easy for those who might not have a visual language to communicate in, or they're looking for one outside of their alphabets. Do a little bit more research to get a little bit understanding, so you're not exploiting. I think folks don't have another scenario to compare exploitation to, so they may not understand that what they're doing might be offensive. And again, it's a lot of education, it's a lot of protocoling, and it's a lot of there's still a lot of demonstration and examples that need to be educated, and we're just not there yet. But the conversations are happening now, which is nice.
Cool. We have a question from YouTube. Can you speak more to metaphor and its relationship to sovereign indigenous design, and why it is important to use symbolic references? And this is from Jennifer Papararo.
Yeah, I think too, it kind of goes into saying that it is hard to envision a world before European contact. And part of that is we're so ingrained to know, we're so ingrained to communicate through English. So we're so dependent on English. So in terms of how we capture, how we write, how we document, how we learn something, is more through text base, or it's a little bit more through actual media or tools. So how do we communicate before tools, or sorry, before the English language? How do we communicate, and how do we translate science before the science textbook? So kind of going to, metaphorically, if you're going to compare something to something, it might be through either a living thing from the land, it might be from the animal. And I think people, because we don't rely on, let's say, the stars for navigation, or the star knowledge and how it's so useful within our land resources, we don't rely on traditional animals to kind of have some of that metaphorical sense. So there's a little bit of a disconnect on this idea of metaphor, because it's hard for non-Indigenous people to think about how our communication systems, how our educational systems, and how our kind of way of life is demonstrated before contact. So and I don't think we will be in a space to go back to that. So it is very respected to know the strength of tribes that have held that knowledge of thousands and thousands of years. So thinking about creation stories and family histories, and how origins of things. There might be some a little bit more figurative and metaphorical language. And then also too, some of the translations from indigenous knowledge may not necessarily translate into an English word. So sometimes I know the English language can translate our culture, especially for those who take things very literal, in a very new age, like hippie sense. What sometimes it's the only English words we have to explain something, and that's a challenge too.
I think the next question actually is very closely related. Um, uh, Amy Gustinchik says, I know that you can't lump all indigenous people into one pan-indigenous group, but would or does finding commonalities help to spread the importance or existence of native language, both visual and spoken?
Yeah, so this kind of goes into reference of how colonization or colonialism even too kind of put labels onto things. So uh, traditionally tribes, we didn't call ourselves, like I didn't, go into a different community and say that, oh, I'm Lakota, I'm just, oh, I'm a human, oh, I'm a person, oh, I'm a protector of the prairie, however I want to label ourselves. But once contact happened and they're creating maps and they're pushing for our extinction. So the root of genocide comes from displacement from the land. So once we started to really label and put labels to identities, it kind of broke us up. Now, the commonalities come from our territories. So for example, because a lot of tribes within the Midwest relied on, grass or the buffalo, or even to our languages. Our languages come from animals. So one of the reasons why Lakotas and Nakotas are so closely together, or we were under this umbrella of Sioux, we're trying to break away from that umbrella, it's because all our languages are rooted from probably birds that were within that same territory. Or if not birds, wolves or coyotes or any type of animal that will probably express some type of voice. And depending on the territory that those animals are native to and the people that are native to that area, we're going to share those commonalities. So it probably wasn't until contact came when they started to break us up and really label us that there was some distinction. But fast forward to post contact or now here, the beautiful part of that sharing is that either we hold stories of tribes that went extinct and give them some acknowledgement and respect, or even to if we went to either war with a tribe and we nearly extincted them, we still carried their stories with us to give them some type of respect and acknowledgement. And we don't see a lot of that, especially in this fight against extinction. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, so I'll bring us back. But just to know that there is commonalities, because a lot of us tribes, we shared a lot of that resources because our motives was protecting that land, protecting that prairie, protecting that desert, protecting the oceans, the Arctics, the Amazon. So what resources were there, we were shared. But again, there's going to be different birds and animals in the Dakotas than there is in Montana or even in Canada, or even too. So there's distinctions based on what responsibilities of territories that we were protecting. So I hope that gives some type of reference to the question and doesn't necessarily confuse.
Fantastic. We have another question. Sadie, could you please speak more to the role of alphabets, fonts, and typography in visual sovereignty? For example, is there a writing system or a style of typeface that references Lakota visual culture? From J. Wall.
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no because speaking to elders, well, I shouldn't say I can't speak for all 580 languages, but what I can share is that there are tribes that don't want their language written. And two, a lot of colonialism forced tribal languages to get written down. And one of the reasons why we didn't want to get written is because of the exploitation. The result of the exploitation is what you would see in places like Germany or France or Spain when they're performing our culture over there. But if they're misusing our language and they're misusing our prayers, it's very disrespectful. So in the time of, let's say, the reservation period, or the time when they're forcing our language into Bibles or hymns, there is a great force on that type. So that's kind of where the typography comes from. Now there's many tribes that had their own writing system. Even before Sequoia did their Cherokee writing, there's tribes, for example, like the Cree or the Ponca, or other tribes that have specific characters and letters. Now, I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of those languages, but it is beautiful to know that that form of writing, pre-contact, still exists. And you can even see it too in a broader, our relatives down in the Yucatan, like our Mayan, how much the Mayan alphabet is now being more flourished. When folks think Mayans and Aztecs and Incas, they don't exist, they do. And how, their language and their calendars and their forms of math are being preserved. Now, bringing some of those languages into, let's say, typography, because now we are in a position of relying and being dependent on written resources. And if we want our youth to learn a lot of these languages, it's going to have to be written out, or for those who want their language written out. Using, let's say, the Cherokee syllabi written by the Sequoia, and thinking about, there has been documentaries and there has been practices on using that specific language into various typefaces, or even to what does this font look like bolded, italicized? What does this font look like if it has, or if it's serif or sans serif? So I'm not in that realm, because I'm not wasn't really interested in typography or fonts or whatnot. But if I were to get on a project of, let's say, doing a Lakota language book, I would want some more type choices or font choices based on what we got, and that is going to take a designer. So there are Lakota designers, youth, that are probably going to be coming up and want to invent more type weights and styles and different types of carats, or sizing of our language, but we have to get the space ready for them. We got to build the framework, so by the time they get into that classroom, it will be okay for them to start practicing using different type and font styles for their traditional languages.
Very cool. So we can just type that down. Nice. So I wanted to bring us to something that you said. I think that struck a big chord with me in the start, which was about the uneven access to resources. And this references something that Drew mentioned in the chat, I think at the end of the workshop. Drew's our rep from First Stories. He said, those with greater access to monopolized resources will have much greater development socially. And historically, indigenous people have been limited in their access to certain resources, which has slowed development. At York, we're very conscious about digital literacies, and we look very much into the community around us to think about, how we can help. I wanted to say, if you could comment a little further about the state of digital literacy in the communities that you're in, and I guess the desire, I think, to catch up with the world, or to establish your own standards for that kind of literacy.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great conversation to really think about where we're progressing in the future. I know. So I'm going to say it this way. When I was studying at North Carolina State, which is a very good school, by the way. I think sometimes when I reference North Carolina State, they think I'm speaking negative on it, but I'm not. When we learned a lot about future trends in technology, we didn't necessarily talk about accessibility, or those who would have access to technology, let alone who would be able to afford the technology. So if I was sitting in a classroom, we're talking about augmented reality, we're talking about the Oculus goggles for your phone, or we're talking about more, more virtual reality gaming spaces. All that sounds cool. It sounds wonderful. Like it's, you know, very interesting areas of research, but if I am in a position where I want to go be an educator at my home, or my obligations to return back to my tribal community, other designers don't have that. They don't have that responsibility, or other designers aren't going to get their teaching degree and having their hand raised and saying, I'm going to go teach, at a reservation, or I'm going to go teach at a First Nations tribal territory. So because they're not wanting to go there, and even to the community is looking for more educated folks indigenous to their communities, we need to make sure that those educators are aware. So even if they're in a space where they can't afford technology, they don't have access to Wi-Fi, cell phone service, how can we bring some of these ideas to them so that they can start being in these conversations and not getting left out? Now, the downsides to this is there's still tactics of keeping resources away from Native Americans. We see in the United States, part of that, we see that within our reservations. It's a little bit harder for us to vote for presidency, especially when may come from a community where there's no home address. It might be a P.O. box address, and some states require home addresses to vote. So even something like that is a step back to technology. I am pretty open about saying that in the means of eliminating resources, the Native American demographic is usually the first demographic that gets a resource cut from the US government. And in my computer science class, I get my students to really think about the wealth or accessibility. So seeing, let's say, Microsoft AI, or even to looking at Apple homes as a case study. If Apple is creating homes where Wi-Fi is already installed in that home, you don't need an internet router, you already have your 5G service. Silicon Valley is now, that's the only homes that they have. For those who can afford those homes, the more across the nation, people are going to have homes with Wi-Fi installed in them. Well, is there going to be a time where the reservation can have those homes? If we can't, and the predominant non-Indigenous has those homes, they could easily cut Wi-Fi off. So thinking, what are we going to do as a demographic when they cut a resource like Wi-Fi off from us? Or even one of the reasons why that's a reality for us is because in some spaces it's very rural. We don't have access to electricity or running water, or even now, I don't know if anyone follows Wall Street, but clean water is becoming a commodity. So that's one resource that they can cut. So if they see internet the same as water, and they know that they can cut water from us, they're going to do it with the internet too. And kind of progressing into thinking about technology in those rural spaces, or even if those communities are wanting more revitalization of culture, are tech companies thinking of us? So for example, in conversations with Amazon, well, would Alexa ever speak in a tribal language? Could I ever speak to Alexa in Lakota? If I can't, why not? And if I can, when can I? We're getting more language influencers who are translation movies, but just to kind of give a little bit of reference that we are going to want access to these resources too. But if we're not brought to the table, or if we don't have Indigenous knowledge or an Indigenous designer and a lot of planning of these areas of tech, it's not going to be beneficial for us. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it as artificial intelligence is coming to farmers in the Midwest, and how destructive farming is. How could AI either help us? Well, one, see it as, will AI even help us, for us who want to revitalize that land? And who is programming land knowledge into that AI resources? And if it's not Indigenous, then who? So to really try to push on getting those students or the next generation to think of themselves as inventors when a resource like technology or internet could be easily cut from us. And it's a real conversation to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of my response to that really is it's rooted in the workshop that we were ideating around as well, and to think about a send out of a care package as some of us received yesterday, and the response to that. So in a very simple way, what we did during the workshop and virtual tour was to give people a number of prompts to go out and look for an eastern pine tree and sit under it and experience it in multiple different ways, feeling the branches, feeling the needles, smelling it, listening to the surroundings, etc. And then listening to a story about its symbol within as the Great Tree of Peace. And uh, I guess the question that is kind of percolating in my mind, it's really in the future, like what are these ground up approaches that we can activate or design that will subvert the monopoly of resources from the colonialist, modernist, and maybe capitalist structures as well. So I mean, I think that's a real, again, that's a real conversation, and I hope we can continue talking about these. We really want to stay in touch with you and make sure that this conversation stays alive, but at this point, I think we should wrap up. And I just want to thank everybody who's been here, and if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us and get in touch with Sadie as well. Yeah, so at this point, I would like to thank you so much, Sadie, for your time. This has been amazing. I would also like to thank my co-organizer, Angela, from the Department of Design. Thank you so much also for our assiduous conversations, which I really think are where all the work is, in organizing something like this. The conversations that we have had with Sadie over the last months really have been very rewarding for us. So to be able to bring some of this to you guys, I think we're really, really proud of this.